our Wellington Maturity series of webinars and events that we are running throughout October, November and December. Some of you will have seen our kind of introduction to P3M3. It was just an article really giving a little bit of an insight into P3M3, what it is and kind of how it works. And we have lots of other stuff ready for you over the next few weeks. But today we felt it was really, really important to give you a perspective that you maybe don't get from the articles. And that is what happens if we speak to a real life P3M3 assessor or more than one, and kind of get a little bit of insight into what really goes on when we do each of those assessments. So today we have with us Mike Belch, and I'm going to get him to introduce himself in a second. We are going to do this slightly differently. It's not your typical webinar. We are going to do it as more of a discussion style. So yeah, for those of you that don't know me, my name's Emma Arnath Pemberton. I'm the Director of Consulting Services at Wellington. I'm one of our qualified P3M3 assessors. And yeah, I run the PMO Academy, and I will be running a number of the webinars that we'll be doing around this topic. So I'm just going to get Mike to introduce himself, and then we'll start getting into the discussion, and I hope you enjoy it. We are going to be taking questions in the chat, so feel free to add them in, and we'll have a little bit of a look to see what we've got at the end if we have time. So hi Mike, thanks for being here.
Hey Emma. So as discussed, my name's Mike Belch. I'm a licensed P3M3 assessor, and I'm, again, like Emma, I'm a PMO specialist, so I have a real sort of strong focus on PMOs, and you kind of very, very quickly came to the realization that the link between PMOs and P3M3 is really strong, and so that's what drew me into P3M3 in the first place.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike, for being here. So we're going to start off with, for those that don't know much about P3M3, really kind of, yeah, human perspective. And we're going to start off with, what is it? So could you give us an idea of what P3M3 is and a little bit about, you know, how it works, just so people have a little bit of context before we get into yours and my experiences?
Sure. So P3M3, Axelos, which used to be the Cabinet Office, is now a joint venture between the government and Capita, I believe. Axelos love their acronyms, and P3M3 is one of those almost impenetrable ones, but it's actually really simple. It is, P3 is portfolio program project, or project program portfolio, depending which way you think about it. Management maturity model, and the key thing there is maturity. So we're looking at a model for the for understanding the maturity of an organization's portfolio program and project management. It uses a inquisitive approach. Typically, one or two assessors would come into an organization following some pre-planning. They would look at a whole bunch of evidence during a desktop study, actually going into your organizational SharePoint, looking at printouts, finding evidence for your particular strengths, your particular weaknesses. They would then back that up with an interview with key members of staff, not just people involved in project delivery, but things like stakeholders and potentially even clients if you want them to. Following that, they would write a report, circle back with you with that report, and then ultimately publish a report that tells you your strengths, your weaknesses, and a part of the real value of a P3M3 assessment is a set of recommendations, working with you to prioritize those, but a set of recommendations for what you would do to get to the next level. Now, levels, something I haven't mentioned so far. P3M3 uses a set of levels from 0 to 5, where 0 is anarchy, chaos. We don't have an approach to project management, and 5 is this kind of like mythical, almost unattainable nirvana. If I said most organizations in the UK are in the mid-2s, and that level 3 is actually a very, very good organization, you'll get an idea for like the 4s and the 5s are getting up into the lofty heights, and as I say, 5's almost academic. That level, you come out with a level for each of a number of perspectives that we look at. I'll tell you in a second what perspectives are. And then you come up with an overall score. Now that score, that single score, that can be useful for things like certification purposes. So there may be organizations, you may be dealing with an organization, one of your clients, and your client says, I'm only going to deal with companies who've got level 3. So what you need is an assessment that comes out with a certification score that gives you a level 3. In what may be more useful though for most organizations is not to have that absolute score level, but to really focus on which of the specific areas of project, program, and portfolio delivery you're strong and weak at. So so P3M3 uses a set of perspectives. I'll go through those very briefly. Organizational governance is how your organization selects projects, how it authorizes projects, how it works around gateways, around stage gates and that sort of stuff. Benefits and requirements management should be pretty obvious what that is. Financial controls, risk management, stakeholder management, resource management, and management controls. And management controls versus organizational governance. Some people sort of think, well, what's one versus the other? Organizational governance is everything you do to a project from outside it at the organization level. Management controls is everything you do within a project to move it forward. So management controls is what your project support and what your PMO and what your project manager are doing inside the project, with things like weekly, monthly reporting, with I know your marking down progress on your project schedule, your routine day-to-day operations and so on, in actually moving the project forward. So going across then each of those 7 perspectives are a number of threads. Now there are 13 threads. They're not all mandatory. I'm not going to go through them all, but some of them are really sort of important. Some are things like assurance, and they cross-cut. So how do we assure risk management? How do we assure your management controls? How do we assure your financial controls, and so on? So you can see how these threads cut across each of the perspectives. Other threads: asset management, infrastructure and tools, information and knowledge management, planning. You know, planning is something, you know, that should be bread and butter for most organizations doing projects, but you'd be surprised sometimes it's not. So there are these 7 perspectives, 7 threads, all of which, that 7 times 13 gives you a number of investigation areas, and your P3M3 assessor will look at all of those and come up with ultimately a set of scores for each of your 7 perspectives, and then an overall score, and that will tell you across the board what you're good at, what you're not so good at, and therefore to be able to derive from that where you can improve your performance. So that's kind of P3M3 in a nutshell.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mike. I think it's fair to say for those that are new to the world of P3M3, it's a pretty in-depth approach to seeing how you're doing. And Mike, as you mentioned, we are seeing that more organizations in kind of their contractual needs and tenders and things, they are asking people to prove their level of maturity, or the fact that they have an independent view and that they are working towards that. It's a strategic, disciplined decision to work on their PPM maturity.
As one thing I wanted to mention, I talked about Axelos earlier. Now, most people are familiar with Axelos because of things like PRINCE2, managing successful programs, management of risk, management of portfolios, and so on. P3M3 is agnostic. P3M3 doesn't care if you are using the APM's approach to project delivery, if you're using Praxis, if you're doing entirely agile. Okay? P3M3 cares with how you deliver projects, not the methodology that you use. I think that's really, really important. Just because it comes from Axelos doesn't mean you can only assess P3M3 Prince 2 organizations. You can assess project, program, and portfolio management regardless of what methodology you're doing.
And it's important, I think, to note as well that it's tailorable. So that's part of the planning process, is to kind of decide which bits do apply to the organisation and what is actually going to be assessed. And we'll talk about that, I guess, in a little while as well. Awesome, thanks, Mike. So let's get into some of our experiences of doing maturity assessments. So the first kind of topic or question, what are the typical areas for improvement, do you think, for organisations that are undertaking an assessment? What do we tend to see quite often?
Okay, I think I talked about those perspectives earlier. Okay, and just as a reminder, organisational governance, how we manage projects at the organizational level, benefits and requirements management, financial controls, risk management, stakeholder management, resource management, and management controls, which, contrasting with the first one, is how we move a project forward internally. I think organizations are, from my experience, I see the most problems in benefits and requirements management. So up front, capturing and putting under appropriate change control a set of requirements that's been socialized with and agreed by all stakeholders, and these under appropriate change control, and then or at the back end of that, benefits tracking once the project has delivered against all of those requirements, tracking that those benefits are actually being realized and can ultimately, if challenged, and this is really leaning into portfolio management and program management more than project management, but can show that the investment in that project was the right thing. So I regularly see weaknesses and lower scores in benefits management, requirements management, organizational governance. If you don't have a good, strong PMO, if you have just standalone project organizations, standalone project teams, then they are going to be quite good at management controls, because that's what Prince 2 teaches you. They're certainly going to be good at financial controls, because you sit in an organization delivering projects based on someone somewhere giving you some money to do that, and you ain't going to get the money if you don't provide the good finance. You can't show that you have good financial controls. Stakeholder management may be weaker, resource management a little weaker, but it's the I'd say the next biggest area where we probably see weaknesses is around risk management. So if risks tend to be something that people go gung-ho on at the start of a project, they get this great risk register, and then it becomes a piece of shelfware. And very, very quickly, it just, it gets stale. Nobody refers back to it, and when something bad happens within a project, or when they fail to spot and actually spot and take advantage of something positive, a positive risk and opportunity, it can sometimes get quite ugly and quite bloody, that you should have known this was coming, and then you get into it, and it was in the risk register, but nobody has done anything about it. It's not been touched over the past few months and so on. So I'd say, from a perspective point of view, those are the weak ones: the benefits and requirements management and the risk management. If you have a PMO, then your organizational governance is definitely going to be better, and possibly your stakeholder management and your resource management. In terms,
Sorry, I was going to say, maybe like the management control as well, we tend to find that, if you do have that structure in place, then chances are, by the very definition that you're having a maturity assessment, you've got a team of people or somebody that's at least identifying that there are gaps, and they want help with that.
Indeed, yeah. So that actually, interestingly, looking at gaps and realizing that you need help and so on, in terms of those threads, assurance, so it's one thing to know that your project is doing the right thing, but it's another to know that your project's doing it in the right way.
Absolutely.
And you need to give, and you basically, assurances about giving management confidence that the project will, or the program or the portfolio will do what they said they would do in terms of outputs, time, cost, quality, benefits, and so on. So assurance can be an afterthought. Assurance can sometimes be done by the wrong people. They aren't necessarily independent from those doing delivery. I'd say another area in terms of those threads where you can see weaknesses, information and knowledge management. Projects are temporary organizations, right? A project is set up, it delivers. If you're lucky, it does an orderly shutdown, and then your project team gets sent on to the next project. That's what projects are about, right?
Yep.
And if you don't do that orderly shutdown, and in particular if during project delivery, if you don't use your SharePoint properly, if you don't do lessons learned throughout the project and at the end, then any information, and particularly any knowledge about the best ways of doing delivery, any organization about any knowledge about key recurring issues within your client or with your key stakeholders, that's going to be lost, and that's going to mean that you're going to hit your head against the same brick walls the next time around.
Yeah, and I think that's a big thing, just industry wide, is that whole knowledge management piece. I think very few people have really nailed it. And interestingly, though, we do tend to see kind of some trends within industries as well. So, you know, if you're in a military defense organization or maybe nuclear, you might actually be pretty good at risk and assurance, whereas, you know, in a banking institution or academic, you have different things that are necessarily priorities. So we do tend to see like a bit of a trend within industries as well, don't we?
Yep.
And I think it's important to say, just to kind of close off this one, is that there is a bit like PMO, there is no one size fits all outcome. So it's easy for us to kind of sit here and just talk through our experiences and kind of say, you know, these are the characteristics that we tend to see, like, you know, you're unlikely to hit a level 2 if you don't have, you know, a good level 2 if you don't have a PMO in place, because that's the team that's going to bring that consistency, that repeatability of processes. But there really is no one size fits all, is there? I imagine in your experience like mine, you go into every organization and it's a very different conversation each time.
Yeah, indeed.
Cool. So let's move on slightly. What would you say are your lessons learned? So now that that's a good segue, actually, we've just talked about knowledge management. In terms of what have you learned when undertaking assessments on behalf of the organization?
I'd say in order, make sure you have strong leadership advocating for the assessment. Okay. So you're doing this for a reason. Make sure somebody very senior within the organization is sponsoring it, and there is really good communication from the top, from your sponsor, as to why we're doing this, why it's important, and why it's really important for you as an individual who may be called on to participate in the assessment, why it's really important that you do that and that you be honest. So a second lesson learned is be honest. You know, don't choose for assessment only projects that you know have gone well. You know, look at areas of your business where you have previously been weak. Look at projects that are in flight. Look at projects that have closed. You know, but if you only expose to the assessors stuff that you know is very, very good, then they're not going to get that. They're not going to get that holistic view. And understand, you know, the assessor is only going to be able to look at a limited number of projects. You're typically paying a fee for an assessment that comes out of an understanding of the number of days that this assessment is going to take, the number of interviewees that the assessors are going to have to talk to, the number of documents that they're going to have to look at, right? So
yeah.
If you're so they can't ever look at all of your projects. So you've got to be really honest with yourself and really sort of thorough in making sure that you select, you know, the right projects. Yeah.
And I think for me that's the same thing, but when we're looking at finding people to interview. So I don't know about you, but I've certainly had
Yeah,
somewhere, I've only been given people who can provide the very most positive response about how everything works. And I've also had the opposite, which is, I've only seen people who are going to give me the worst case scenario. And I think the sponsors know who's who. So
yeah,
I would say is, find that, because neither of those gives us a balanced view. So I think it's almost like, trying to do exercise, isn't it? You're only cheating yourself if you only give us people who are super happy and engaged at the same
correct.
time as if you just give us the worst case scenario. It's
Yeah.
not going to be an easy read.
Yeah, and I think and that segues nice into my final lesson, really, which is about following on from honesty. Is we don't just want honesty from leadership in choosing everything right and doing it for the right reasons. We want honesty from the people that we're assessing, from the people we're talking to, and the documents that we're being given. So management have to really make it clear to the attendees, the participants, that they're in a safe environment, right? That their responses are going to be confidential, right? I've had in the past, I've had a client come to me and say, okay, I want to see all of the interview records. And well, no, because we agreed up front that all of this was going to be confidential. And the reason that we agreed that all of the interview records were going to be confidential was because that would allow us to get honest answers out of the people that we're talking to, because they felt like they were in a safe space. And if they wanted to say, honestly, the person who is the single biggest problem in this organization is Nigel, right? And Nigel is the one who's giving us the most grief. And if you want to do an improvement, it's Nigel you've got to get rid of. Then that forms part of your notes. You wouldn't necessarily put in the report, the
Nigel.
issue here is Nigel.
Yeah.
But that would allow you to look around and see, explore in a little bit more detail. And then at the same, and just one little codicil to that safe space thing, and this goes across. This is project management or facilitation 101, right? Is when you do anything that's in a workshop environment, and this is particularly towards the end where you're sort of looking at, you may do a final workshop before you issue the report to look at gaps and to just sense check what you've done. In a workshop, if you have a range of people and one of those people is very senior in the organization, that can inhibit your ability to get honest answers out of other people in the room because they may feel intimidated.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
you need to carefully manage the attendees, and you need to, as a good facilitator, if you see that there's one person dominating and other people are not taking part, then don't be afraid of having that difficult conversation, taking him aside and saying, look, would you mind, and you ask him or her, would you mind just kind of like stepping out because I'm seeing a problem here.
Yeah, definitely.
So those really, those are definitely my lessons learned.
Yeah, definitely. I think I would just add to that is like what happened, like almost the roadmap that comes out of it is that, make sure that everybody is committed to it. And like you say, people understand it's not about a witch hunt, it's about improving and getting that step change in maturity so that we can, maybe get awarded better contracts in the future and, to really show that this is something that we are committed to as an organization. So, we've talked a little bit about the right level of sponsorship, but do you have any tips for companies being assessed? Anything that, they should maybe think about?
There's a bit of overlap here, right? But the first one, plan it.
Yes.
Okay? just really engage with, and your assessors should be leading this, right? But plan what you're going to do and make sure that before anyone comes on site, it's absolutely clear what projects are being assessed, that your PMO or your project managers or your project coordinators have got all of the documentation printed off, that there are rooms booked, that there are Outlook appointments in calendars, yeah, that lunches and teas are booked, that all of these things are just cast in stone so that when when the assessors rock up on site, there's the absolute minimum of doubt about what's going to be done. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's about almost approaching the assessment as an organisation, as a sponsor as well, with an open mind and a willingness to hear what people say. I mean, you know, we've all, I'm sure, been on the receiving end as teams to, you know, to feedback that it's hard to hear. And I think, you know, it's almost not taking it personally and focus on what the report focuses on, which is what is going to tell you what's good and what can be improved, rather than specifically this is really bad. Because the reality is, it's unlikely that, you know, people are going to suck across the board. And that's a really important difference. And I'm sure you've had it and I've had it, where we've kind of given the feedback and they've kind of immediately shut down and kind of gone down the road of, well, I don't agree with that, that's not what we do. And it's that human element of whether you agree or not, somebody feels enough this way to tell a third party about it. So, you know, whether you agree with it or not, we need to at least listen and listen to it with an open mind and look at it from a different perspective, maybe sometimes.
Yep. So you certainly have to, you certainly have to be prepared to have bad news, but you also have to have the appetite to actually want to follow up. So we're going to give you some areas where you're strong and weak. We're going to give you some suggestions for improvement, and really, you know, you have to want to make that improvement afterwards. Unless the only reason that you want this P3M3 assessment is to get that number because that number helps you respond to an ITT. If that's the case, brilliant, fill your boots, you know, but it's very rare. It's very rare that anyone would ever do that. Yeah? And then I say the final sort of tip there, apart from plan it and make sure you've got the appetite to follow up and so on, is to just get everyone engaged and get everyone behind the assessment. So we've talked already in the lessons learned about making sure that people understand that this is a safe space, right? And that we've got all the engagements in the calendars, we've got all the meetings in the calendars and so on, right? But even on the day of the assessment, when these people, and I'm going to avoid cliche, which I came out with earlier, which is rock up, you know, but when these guys, when your team turn up, you know, make sure that everyone has had that message of why this is important, as why we're doing this, why this is a great thing for your organization to be doing. And that comes back to having that strong leadership, having that strong sponsor, leading the way, you know, leading from the front.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned it earlier. My last tip as well would be around, like, know thyself as an organization. So, you know, understand the different levels and know yourself well enough to know that whether level 5 is something you want to attain, although there are very few companies that have done that successfully. And there are case studies on the Axelos website, but, you know, most organizations, like you said at the beginning, are actually just getting to like a 3, or, you know, knocking on for a 3.5, maybe, you know, level 4. Is just getting the consistency and everything being used to do continuous improvement and find trends. Actually, that's a great place to be for most organizations. So I think know thyself and don't just say, well, we've got to get from 1 to 5 because 5 is the top, and really understand that there might not be benefit to your type of organization, to your culture, to spend the amount of time and effort and money that it can take to change the culture enough to get, you know, to those really aspirational levels.
Yep, indeed.
Yeah, okay. So let's move on from that and think about what happens kind of during or after the assessment. What do you think? We've talked about tips, but what should companies avoid from doing? I think
well, we talked about one of those.
Sorry, go on.
You go ahead. Sorry, I talked over you.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's very easy to come out of a review like that and, you know, be very inspired and want to change everything and, you know, everything else. But what do you think people should avoid doing?
Okay, avoid during the assessment, avoid letting people avoid you, right? So make sure that people do actually take part. You know, I found on a couple of assessments, actually having someone, say, from the PMO with you at every changeover period to go and chase down that elusive Nigel, if Nigel isn't turning up for the interview, that he's supposed to do, that you go and hunt you go and hunt him down and make sure that he does come, because, or if you just simply accept that you're a really, really busy organization and that there are going to be some people who can't turn up or who may ditch at the last minute, then have some backups, yeah. But there's nothing worse for an organization to be paying out for an external consultant to come in and then for the 1.5 hours of that scheduled interview to just be sat there twiddling their thumbs. That does nobody any favors. Yeah, it doesn't look it doesn't make you look a professional, and it wastes everybody's time. So that's the first thing. The second thing we've already touched on, actually, which is that kind of like the hands over the ears, no, I'm not listening. You have to listen to what you may perceive to be bad news, and you have to look on it as an opportunity to improve. And then really, in terms of what to avoid, then is don't try to boil the ocean. Don't try to drink water through a fire hose. Don't try to eat the elephant in one go. Am I coming up with enough cliches here? Just pick what you can do the quickest. Pick what is easiest, that's going to give the best return on your investment.
Yeah, and I think that's where we've mentioned roadmap before, is actually make sure that you commit to building and understand the value of building that, so that you can say, right, we're going to hit these 3 things first, because there may be, to use a cliche, low hanging fruit, quick wins, whatever you want to call them, whilst working on some other stuff, so that you can really see the value of, as we go through this roadmap, it's not just, oh, we'll release a load of stuff in 6 months' time.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, cool. That's really interesting. One of the key questions, and I know we've had this question from 1 or 2 people in the question panel. We always get this question when we talk about P3M3. How long does it take me to move from one level to the next?
1 year. No.
Yeah.
Actually, you should not look to make a whole level jump in one of the areas being assessed really in less than a year. You can probably, with a well-planned program, you can get an organization up one whole level in a year, or get yourself from, say, if you get a 2.5 score, to get yourself from 2.5 to 3, which would be amazing. You could probably do that in a year with a well-planned program of improvement. But you could do some of the other things much quicker.
Yeah, it's the cultural change that comes with each of these different levels. So yeah. I think 1 year is probably true to get from a 1 to a 2, because there are some tactical things that you can do to kind of get you there. But then once you start moving from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, I think probably 18 months to 2 years. Certainly, that's the planning window that we work with our clients with.
There's no question that the old 80-20 rule applies here, right? Let's insert another cliche. That low-hanging fruit is there to be plucked. Make those changes, make those easy changes that will have the biggest impact on project, program, or portfolio delivery. Absolutely, but the rest of it gets increasingly difficult, and there could come the point at which you just simply can't do it, or you don't have the appetite to take it any further, or there's not the return on investment to take it any further.
Yeah, I mean, the famous case studies, like Transport for London, they did level 5, but it took them, years and years and a lot of money to get to that. And did they make savings? Absolutely they did, but it took an insane amount of investment from every single person in that organization to really fundamentally change the way that they think and their mindset on project management.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so those are some things like not to do and how long it can take, which is always, it's a very common question. But one of my last questions for you before we go to the questions that we've got in the panels, what happens after the assessment? We've
Okay.
talked a little bit about a roadmap already, but what would you say is typical? What tends to happen after an
Well, let's
assessment?
understand what happens. So the assessment, you have the kind of the fact finding stuff, and then your assessors go away and they write their report. Yeah. And if you do it properly, that report shouldn't be a surprise to you. And the reason that report shouldn't be a surprise to you is the assessor should come back with you. And if you have the budget for this sort of stuff, you should run some workshop or a workshop to sort of look at any gaps to understand which areas of the report are just blatantly wrong, and therefore they need to do a bit more digging. So ultimately, the report that should come should be based on information that everyone has agreed on. Yeah. And then really the value then comes from taking that list of recommendations and prioritizing them. Now that can be an entirely optional service, right? You can take your P3M3 assessment report, you can take all of those recommendations, and you can say thank you, because what you have at that point as a client organization is you have a document that's of real business value to you, right? So you've paid for it, you've got real business value to it. But if you're dealing with an organization if you're dealing with an assessor who has experience of doing this capability improvement in other organizations, then perhaps you want to look at taking it a little bit further with them, and that is, well, help us understand and help us to prioritize, facilitate some workshops for us so that we can look at what really matters and what it is that we're going to do next to improve. Taking that one step further, you could actually and this is not me advertising for Wellington, obviously, but you could then employ Wellington to actually help you deliver those improvements. And finally, I think the one thing that you should look to do is, having set in place a change program, particularly the first time you do this, having set in place a change program, look to do another P3M3 assessment at the end of that program to check back that you've actually done what you set out to do. So if you were 2.5 and you said I was 2.5 and I want to get to 3 across the board, then in a year's time, or whatever the plan says, let's come back and do that and show that we have come to 3, because what that and hopefully you can demonstrate what the new organization looks like, and hopefully all of those key stakeholders can then see that investment that they put into the initial assessment and the investment that they've put into the cultural change and the organizational change and the capability improvement in the meantime has actually been worth it. And that may then give you the impetus to then take it to the next level if that's the right thing for your organization.
Yeah, and it really closes off that continuous improvement loop. We start off with, what do we need to find out about? Where are we today? How are we going to get to wherever we aspire to be? But closing that loop of, how did we do? Because a lot of the time we don't define in our projects and programs what success actually looks like. And like you say, doing that, almost after maybe a year, doing like a bit of a dip check, to just see, do we need to make any course corrections? Has the world shifted? Certainly this year we've seen the world shift somewhat, and to really kind of almost recommit to the idea of improving our PPM maturity. But yeah, absolutely, I think, do it again at some point in the future. Cool, so that's been really interesting. Those are all the questions that I have, but we do have a couple of questions in the panel from listeners, 2 of which are to do with benefits management, not surprisingly, given that it is considered a dark art for our industry, and really asking about, well, sometimes it's not top priority and it needs to come from the top. What can we do about it? Is this a case for change? Can people use an assessment like this as a case for change? Or is there something more tactical, would you say, that from your experience, that you might have seen?
One of the things that I didn't mention is that some of those 7 perspectives, some of those 13 threads can be considered as optional.
Yep.
So if you're an organization that doesn't do benefits management and doesn't need to do benefits management because you are repeatedly doing projects for clients for money, for example, if you are continually delivering projects and you are just focused on the output that project delivers, then benefits are fairly immaterial, because what mattered was that you delivered that project to time, cost, and quality. So take benefits out of the assessment because you could consider it optional. Take it out and don't waste time having a consultant come back to you and say you're rubbish at benefits management, because actually you don't need to be good at it, right? So understand that the model is flexible and allows you to take things out and put things in. Some things are definitely mandatory. You would never want to take out management control and organizational governance. I would strongly recommend, in fact, I don't think you can take out things like risk management, but be pragmatic at the start about that. So then benefits management, right? I've really talked a lot. When I've used P in this context, I've talked a lot about project, and benefits management tends to come from program management. It tends to be something that an organization looks at the portfolio level. And so if you start doing if you start off with a project level assessment and you're coming up as weak on benefits, then maybe that's a pointer to the fact that you're not actually doing portfolio management as an organization that well. And perhaps the next assessment you want to do is portfolio management within your organization, assuming you have any at all, right?
And based on what you've just said, I think it's important to talk about the project program portfolio relationship in P3M3, in the sense that typically we come in and we do one of those models. So we look at projects, programs, or portfolios. Can we do more than one? Yes, but the reality, I guess, is that it's quite intense looking at that level. So generally, as a rule, people tend to start at project and then move up to program and then move up to portfolio. So yeah, that there is a relationship there. If you, project management, program management isn't going to be, the next best thing that happens in your organization.
Yeah. Actually, you just triggered another thought in my mind, which I maybe should have mentioned earlier. When you're right at the beginning looking at scope and you're doing that planning and you're looking at what you're going to be assessing, right? And let's say you're assessing projects, there is a definite case for understanding who you're going to be assessing. So you may not be looking at project delivery across your whole organization. If you are a international mega corporation, you may only be looking at the British office. So you may only be looking at the British engineering office and not the and not the British manufacturing office or something like that. You may be segmenting right down to specific areas because for example, that's where the greatest need is. So you may be actually wasting your time doing a P3M3 assessment of your whole organization if really you understand that the biggest benefits are to be gotten as an organization from looking at specific areas.
Yeah, and I think we see that quite a lot where we do assessments for a specific function, rather than everywhere. Yeah. And a lot of people, when we do that kind of work, they use it as that case for change. It's almost we've got this, and actually it can help the whole organization to kind of sell that roadmap, that journey that people have. So yeah, absolutely agree with that. Cool. Okay, so we don't have any other questions. So we had a couple around, like I say, how long does it take? It's a very, very common question, and also about the benefits piece. So I want to thank you, and before I do that, I just want to tell everybody that our Wellington Maturity Series is going to continue. We're going to be exploring maturity in more detail. So we have a webinar coming up in a few weeks, which is going to look at the characteristics of the different levels. So looking at each one independently. Some of the characteristics that we see in those kinds of organizations. And also we're going to be looking at how Wellington can kind of support you make that step change in PPM maturity, as well as looking at, the ins and outs. So thank you, Mike. That's been super interesting. It was an honour to have you. And for those of you that want to read more, we will be putting this as an article on our Wellingtone website, wellingtone.co.uk and wellingtone.es for those Spanish-speaking people, just to kind of give you that little bit of extra context that you can read. We hope that you've found this useful. Thank you again, Mike, and we'll hope to see you soon.
Thanks, Emma. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to everyone.
Bye, guys.